Everyone said it was a matter of time. Soaring birth rates, mass migration, a cultural takeover already in motion. The West would bend, Europe would bow, and Islam would inherit the future. That story is falling apart. Not slowly, not theoretically. Right now, in government data, in migration filings, in surveys inside the heartlands of the faith itself. 2 walls have gone up. One in the West, one inside the Muslim world. And the unstoppable force just hit both of them. Let's start with Europe, because the policy reversals there are impossible to ignore. And nowhere is the U-turn sharper than in Sweden, the country that once branded itself a humanitarian superpower. In 2015, at the height of the European migration crisis, Sweden took in 162,877 asylum applications in a single year, the largest annual number since the country started keeping records. Welfare systems strained, integration stalled, concerns about gang violence and segregated neighborhoods exploded into a national debate that had previously been considered too sensitive to even hold. For years, the Swedish establishment had treated criticism of the migration model as borderline taboo. Anyone raising concerns about integration, parallel communities, or the long-term cost of the welfare state risked being branded extremist. Then, the data caught up. Suburb after suburb in Stockholm, Malmö, and Gothenburg developed concentrations of foreign-born populations where unemployment ran double and triple the national average, where police had begun designating vulnerable areas, and where the violence had escalated to the point that Sweden, of all places, recorded among the highest gun homicide rates in Europe per capita. Something had to give. By 2022, the Tidö Agreement changed everything. A right-of-center coalition backed by the Sweden Democrats, the same party that had been politically untouchable for 2 decades, sat down and made a decision that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. They would deliberately reduce asylum rights to the legal minimum allowed under EU and international law. The mission, openly stated, was to make Sweden unattractive to new arrivals. It worked. In 2024, preliminary asylum applications fell to 9,645, a 23% drop from the previous year and the lowest level since the mid-1980s. In 2025, the figure fell further to 6,737. But the numbers tell only half the story. The legal architecture behind them is what really shows the shift. A regulation that took effect in March of 2025 ended the so-called EBO system, where asylum seekers could choose their own accommodation. Authorities said it helped breed segregated parallel societies. Now, financial aid is conditional on living in state-run reception centers. Re-entry bans for rejected applicants extended from 1 to 5 years. The track change route, where rejected asylum seekers could quietly transition into work permits and stay anyway, abolished as of April 2025. And the most striking move of all, the repatriation grant. The Swedish government had proposed raising it to 350,000 Swedish kroner per person, roughly $38,000 US, to take effect in 2026, up from just 10,000 kroner per adult under the old system. A 35-fold increase. The math is simple. Sweden is now willing to write large checks to convince migrants to leave voluntarily rather than fight integration battles for the next 40 years. This is no longer the Sweden of 2015. But Sweden is just the opening act, because Denmark has gone further than any country in Europe. Under Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen and the Social Democrats, Denmark adopted what the government itself describes as a zero-refugee policy, and the numbers back up the language. In 2024, Denmark granted asylum to just 864 people, the lowest figure in over 40 years, with the only exception being 2020, when COVID lockdowns sealed the borders. According to the British Home Office, Denmark's policies have reduced asylum claims to a 40-year low and resulted in the removal of 95% of those whose claims are rejected. 4 asylum claims per 10,000 people in 2024. In Britain, that figure was 16. The deterrent is working. And here's the part nobody outside Scandinavia really understands. This is being done by a center-left government, a social democratic prime minister, the same political tradition that built the Danish welfare state is now the architect of the most restrictive migration regime in the European Union. Fredriksen's argument, delivered in interview after interview, is blunt. The Danish welfare model, she says, cannot survive uncontrolled migration. The poor pay the highest price for failed integration. Overwhelmed schools, gang violence, neighborhoods where state authority becomes secondary. In her own words to Newsweek in mid-2025, it's not a human right to enter Denmark and do a rape and stay. That is a sitting prime minister of a Nordic social democracy in 2025. But Fredriksen's framework goes deeper than rhetoric. It rests on a doctrine the Danish system calls temporality. Under Danish law, refugee status is no longer treated as a path to permanent settlement. It is, by design, temporary, reviewable, revocable. The moment conditions in a country of origin are deemed safe, residency can be withdrawn, even from people who have lived in Denmark for years, learned the language, and built lives there. The clearest example came with Syria. After the fall of Bashar al-Assad in late 2024, Denmark moved to revoke the residency of Syrian refugees from areas the government classified as safe, including Damascus and Homs. Some Danish Syrians began considering whether to return voluntarily, with the government dangling repatriation grants of around $38,000 per person to ease the door open. For thousands of refugees in Denmark, this means living in a state of permanent uncertainty. Then there's the centerpiece, the 2018 Ghetto Package, officially titled One Denmark Without Parallel Societies. It targets neighborhoods where so-called non-Western immigrants and their descendants make up more than 50% of residents, and where crime rates are high, education levels are low, and incomes below the national average. Once an area is designated, the state can demolish social housing to change the demographic mix. But the most controversial provision is what happens to children. Toddlers in these areas, starting at age 1, must attend Danish language and values-based daycare for at least 25 hours a week. If families don't comply, they lose their child benefits. And starting in 2025, refugees on benefits face a 37-hour weekly work obligation, including mandatory internships and language training. This is forced assimilation, backed by the full economic weight of the state. If Sweden is a U-turn, Denmark is a brick wall. But it gets even harder further south, because Germany and France haven't just hardened their borders, they've gone after the ideological infrastructure inside their own cities. On November 5th of 2025, German Interior Minister Alexander Dobrindt banned the organization Muslim Interactive. Authorities raided 7 properties in Hamburg before sunrise, 12 more in Berlin and Hesse. Assets seized, websites taken down. The group, founded in 2020, had built a slick social media presence with thousands of followers on TikTok and YouTube, and had drawn 1,000 supporters to a Hamburg demonstration in early 2024 where signs read, "Caliphate is the solution." Dobrindt was unapologetic. "We will respond with the full force of the law," he said, to anyone who aggressively calls for a caliphate on our streets, incites hatred against the state of Israel and Jews in an intolerable manner, and despises the rights of women and minorities. The Interior State Minister of Hamburg called it a blow against modern TikTok Islamism. This came just over a year after Berlin's previous Interior Minister had banned the Islamisches Zentrum Hamburg in July of 2024 over alleged ties to Iran's supreme leader and support for Hezbollah. The IZH, which operated the so-called Blue Mosque on the shores of the outer Ulster Lake, had been under surveillance by German intelligence for years. Authorities seized evidence the group was operating, in their words, in a highly conspiratorial manner, using charitable fronts to funnel influence and ideology into German Muslim communities. 2 bans, 2 organizations dismantled, both targeting structures that German authorities concluded were trying to build, in the language of the Federal Ministry of the Interior, permanent enemies of the Constitution. This is the part that quietly redefined the German approach. The bans weren't reactions to specific acts of terrorism, they were preemptive, what some legal scholars now call pre-crime enforcement. German authorities are no longer waiting for radical organizations to commit violence. They're dismantling structures whose stated aims, by the government's reading, undermine the constitutional order itself. France took the same logic and pushed it into law. After the 2020 beheading of teacher Samuel Paty for showing a cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad in class, the French state passed an anti-separatism law. It allows the dissolution of religious associations promoting separatism, the closure of radical mosques, and the stripping of citizenship from dual nationals convicted of terrorism. The message, embedded in Republican law, is unambiguous. Loyalty to the Republic is non-negotiable. For a country built on the principle of laïcité, strict secular neutrality of the state, the post-Patti period was a constitutional reckoning. The government concluded that decades of accommodation had produced not integration, but a parallel infrastructure that the Republic could no longer afford to ignore. So it stopped accommodating. Even Ireland, historically among Europe's most open countries, has hardened its stance. After the November 2023 Dublin riots, the Irish government issued more than 2,000 deportation orders in 2024 and began closing what officials call the Belfast back door, the route by which migrants entered the United Kingdom first and then crossed over the open border into Ireland. Eurobarometer data from autumn of 2025 captured just how fast public sentiment was moving. Concern about immigration in Ireland jumped 8 points in just 6 months, well above the EU average. So, how did we get here? For years, parallel societies took root in places where integration stalled. Concerns mounted over segregated neighborhoods, cultural clashes, and the emergence of areas where state authority felt secondary. Then came Patti. Then came waves of attacks across European cities. Then came the slow, grinding realization that the welfare state and uncontrolled migration could not coexist on the same balance sheet. The political left, in particular, faced a choice: lose working-class voters to the far right, or adopt restrictionist policy and frame it through the language of social cohesion. Fredriksson chose the second option. So did Sweden's Tidö coalition. So increasingly did Berlin and Paris. And here's where the story takes a turn that nobody saw coming. Because while Europe was building walls on the outside, something even bigger was breaking on the inside. If you're seeing this play out for the first time and you want to understand what's actually shifting in the global picture, hit subscribe. Because what comes next is the part that nobody talks about. The part that's happening inside the Muslim world itself. And it's the part that quietly dismantles the takeover narrative for good. Now consider Iran. The Islamic Republic claims its population is 99.5% Muslim. The state was built on theocracy. The constitution is religious. The educational system is religious. The legal code is religious. Public life is policed in some form or other by religious authority, or at least that's the official picture. And yet, in June of 2024, the Group for Analyzing and Measuring Attitudes in Iran, known as Gaman, surveyed 77,216 Iranians inside the country, weighted to represent the literate adult population. The findings were extraordinary. Roughly 70% of Iranians opposed the constitution of the Islamic Republic. Only 20% want it to remain. 89% favor a democratic system. 26% specifically want a secular republic. 21% want a constitutional monarchy. A small minority would even welcome a federal structure that decentralizes power away from Tehran entirely. And support for the principles of the 1979 revolution and the supreme leader, well, it's fallen to 11%, down from 18% in 2022. 40% of respondents said regime change was a precondition for any meaningful reform. Again, regime change, a precondition for any meaningful reform. In the country that spent 4.5 decades exporting its ideology, training proxy militias, building Hezbollah, funding Hamas, propping up Assad, and lecturing the world about Islamic governance, the population behind closed doors has already moved on. Not partially, not marginally, decisively. The Woman, Life, Freedom uprising that erupted after the death of Mahsa Amini in 2022 didn't just trigger street protests. It accelerated something that was already brewing. A generational rejection of theocratic rule, especially among the young, the educated, and the urban. Researchers studying Iranian internet usage in the years that followed documented a phenomenon clerics had no answer for. Tens of millions of Iranians began routinely using VPNs like Cybon to bypass state filters. They weren't just streaming Western entertainment, they were reading apostate literature. They were watching debates between ex-Muslims and clerics on YouTube. They were participating in Persian-language Telegram channels where the religious foundations of the regime were being dismantled post by post. The 2025 12-day war between Iran and Israel only deepened the rejection. The state attempted to rally the population around national defense. The population, in survey after survey, refused to confuse defending the country with defending the regime that runs it. Gamon's data isn't an outlier. It's been replicated across multiple surveys, conducted with the help of VPN networks like Siphon, that allows Iranians to bypass state censorship and answer honestly without fear of retaliation. Some critics have raised methodological questions about Gamon's polling, and those debates are real. But the broader pattern, youth disengagement from clerical authority, plummeting mosque attendance, an underground apostate movement, the visible secular hunger of an entire generation, is documented by independent journalists, academic researchers, and even Iran's own state media when they're caught off guard. The theocracy still controls the guns. It does not control the minds. And what's happening in Iran is not isolated. Even Saudi Arabia, long considered the immovable bedrock of Sunni religious authority, is shifting. Under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's Vision 23 reforms, the religious police have been curtailed. Cinemas have reopened. Music festivals draw tens of thousands. And in private surveys conducted with anonymity, independent researchers estimate that 15 to 25% of Saudi youth quietly identify as non-religious. That number was unthinkable a decade ago. Public rejection of the faith remains legally and socially dangerous in the kingdom, but the trend lines are unmistakable. Across the Muslim world, something deeper is at work, something the clerics never planned for: the internet. For 14 centuries, the transmission of Islamic knowledge was tightly controlled. Scholars, imams, state institutions, apostasy taboos. In 12 Muslim-majority countries, leaving the faith can still legally carry the death penalty. Public doubt was not just spiritually dangerous, it was physically dangerous. Communities, families, and governments all reinforced the same boundary. You did not leave. You did not question. And if you did so quietly, alone, and at considerable personal risk. Smartphones changed all of it. What Christianity went through over centuries, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, the long argument with reason and science, is now confronting in decades. Compressed, accelerated, forced into the open by a technology that no clerical authority designed and none of them can fully control. The ex-Muslims of North American organization known as EXMNA has documented this shift in detail. According to their data, 78% of those who left Islam traced their first serious doubts to digital spaces. The subreddit r-ex-Muslim now has over 400,000 members. Hadith contractions, historical critiques, scientific objections, debates over women's rights and slavery and apostasy, all of it now openly discussed in places that no government can fully censor. The driver of departures, according to EXMNA's own survey, 58% cited conflicts with human rights, particularly the treatment of women and LGBTQ individuals. 28% cited conflicts with science. Behind every one of those percentages is an individual story. A young woman in Tehran reading translated philosophy on her phone at 2 a.m. A college student in Cairo finding a comparative religion forum and never quite returned to certainty. A diaspora teenager in Berlin or London or Toronto raising questions her parents cannot answer, and finding online communities that not only validate the questions, but provide answers. This is the mechanism. It does not require open apostasy. It does not require a public break. It requires only a smartphone and a measure of curiosity. The exit, when it comes, often happens silently, over months, sometimes years, long before anyone in the family even realizes the religious commitment has dissolved. In the United States, Pew Research data shows that 24% of adults raised Muslim no longer identify with the faith as adults. Roughly 23% of current U.S. Muslims are converts, but the net impact of religious switching on Muslim population growth is essentially zero. Some studies suggest that 50 to 70% of American converts eventually leave the faith within a few years, citing weak community support and cultural barriers. This is the part the takeover narrative completely missed. The framework assumed religious identity was static, that a Muslim born in 2000 would be a Muslim in 2030, that demographic projections could simply multiply current populations forward. The framework underestimated the corrosive effect of unrestricted information access on rigid religious systems. The clerical monopoly on truth was not just challenged, it was outflanked. And then there's the demographic story itself. Yes, Islam is the fastest growing major religion in the world. Pew Research confirmed in their June 2025 update that the global Muslim population grew by 21% between 2010 and 2020, from 1.7 billion to 2 billion, twice the growth rate of the rest of the world. But here is what the headline number hides. That growth is concentrated in regions with low female education and high fertility rates, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, where the average Muslim woman has roughly 3.1 children. The moment women in those regions gain schooling, contraception, autonomy, fertility rates plummet toward national averages within 1 or 2 generations. We've watched this pattern play out repeatedly in country after country. Iran's own fertility rate has collapsed below replacement level. Tunisia and Turkey track close to European norms. Even in conservative Saudi Arabia, the average woman now has barely 2 children. The Islamic demographic boom is a moment in time, not a permanent feature of the faith. In Europe and North America, Muslim population growth is overwhelmingly driven by migration, not by sustained higher birth rates among second and third generation immigrants. The pattern repeats everywhere it has been studied. Convergence, not divergence, by the third generation. Fertility rates among Muslim families in countries like the United Kingdom, France, and Germany are nearly indistinguishable from the national average. Even in the heart of the Asia-Pacific region, where most of the world's Muslims actually live, fertility rates are falling. Indonesia, the country with the largest Muslim population on Earth, has seen its fertility rate decline by roughly half over the last 40 years. The takeover demographic, the one that fueled 20 years of headlines and 100 YouTube channels, was a snapshot, not a destiny. It assumed conditions that are already starting to unravel. Strip away the fertility advantage, slow the migration pipeline, factor in the silent attrition through apostasy and disaffiliation, and the demographic curve flattens dramatically. The map the takeover narrative depended on is being rewritten in real time. So what do we actually have here? The West has woken up. Nations that once feared being labeled intolerant are now openly prioritizing cultural cohesion, welfare sustainability, and national identity. Sweden, Denmark, Germany, France, and Ireland have shown that even the most liberal societies can reverse course when the costs of failed integration become impossible to ignore. At the same time, the internal foundation of Islam is being eroded by the very technology that once seemed to empower its spread. Smartphones are doing what 14 centuries of debate never could, exposing contradictions, offering alternatives, and giving individuals the private space to question without immediate social destruction. The clerical monopoly on truth is broken. Islam is not disappearing. 2 billion people still hold the faith. Many do so deeply and seriously. That is not the question. The question is whether the era of unchallenged expansion, of demographic inevitability, and cultural dominance is over. The data says yes. The walls are up, the questions are being asked, and the silence that once protected the takeover narrative from scrutiny, that silence is gone. The story everyone agreed on was wrong. The data has been telling us so for years. The world is just starting to listen. So tell us what you think. Was the takeover ever real, or was it always a story that just sounded inevitable until somebody actually checked the numbers? Drop your take in the comments, and if you want more breakdowns like this one, where we follow the data wherever it leads, subscribe to Fall of Nations, because the next collapse, political, demographic, ideological, is already being written. We're just the ones reading it out loud.